Welcome back. Time for the press preview then. It's our first look at what is on the front of Friday's papers, and it's time to check out those headlines with the columnist and broadcaster Steve Richards and the broadcaster and political commentator Salma Shah. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. A very good evening to you, rather belatedly. Let's take a look then at some of those front pages, shall we? Starting with the Metro. They need your help now, reads the front page, as they look at the need for aid in Syria and Turkey following the recent earthquake. Pressures are on the Treasury over tax, according to the front of the Daily Mail, as AstraZeneca snubs the UK to build a plant in Ireland because of corporate taxes. Well, the money-saving expert Martin Lewis is on the front of the Daily Mirror as he condemns raising the cap on energy bills, saying it would be a national act of harm. And greedy banks blasted over savings rates, reads the front of the Daily Express. Blessings for same-sex couples given C of E approval, reads the front of The Guardian, as they look at what is being called a profound shift in the Church's stance on homosexuality. And the front of The Eye investigates claims that untreated sewage is being discharged into the River Colne by Thames Water, an exclusive by them. Here's the FT looking at restructuring within Walt Disney that will see 7,000 jobs axed. And the front of the Daily Star has the headline, Vote Chuckle, as one of the Chuckle brothers announces a campaign to get Britain laughing again. Don't we need that? And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen throughout the programme, you can check out all of the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us discussing them. And to discuss them, Steve Richards and Salma Shah. Very good to see you this evening. So lots to get through. And let's start with the desperate situation, Salma, in Turkey and Syria as well. The front of the Metro has that rescuer carrying the little boy in the striped jumper, and they're asking us to give what we can in order to help that rescue effort.
Yes, and it's one of those things that we are looking at that is absolutely heart-rending, because this is a full-blown humanitarian crisis, and we're going to see a lot of appeals and a lot of people who are going to try and fundraise. I think one of the interesting things about this is especially the relief effort in Syria, because of course diplomatic relations with the Syrian government are not what they should be. And you will have heard the Foreign Secretary today in Rome talking about liaising with the opposition in Syria. And this, I think, will at some point sort of stymie and hamper some of those relief efforts because of the difficult political situation that exists in these countries. But as you can see, these pictures of children that are being helped, after days under the rubble, and this race to try and find survivors continues. So there is definitely an emergency and a panic with this relief effort at present, which is complicated by several issues.
Yes, Steve, they call it the golden period or the golden window, don't they? And it is coming to an end. And of course, it's probably shorter than it would have been if the earthquake had happened in the summer, simply because it's so cold. And you've got this awful situation where people are calling out for help, but the help isn't there, and they're dying of the cold and starvation.
Yeah, it's unbearable. And I can't face, frankly, watching the pictures or reading too much about it. In programmes like this and many others, we analyse how things happen in politics and economics and all the other dramas, and there's a dispute about why and how things happen. Here, there's a natural disaster. It's horrific. And you're almost kind of speechless beyond the issues that Salma has brilliantly summarised about the challenges of making this rescue effort as effective as possible. And in a way, when you see these pictures, and I just glance at them fleetingly because they're unbearable, you hope somehow or other some of the barriers she outlined could be transcended in this case, because you've just conjured up an absolute nightmare of people screaming for help and the help not being there. And there's not much more we can say beyond let's hope the rescue teams do get through in as effective a way as possible. But the origins are, what can we say? It's a natural disaster and it's a form of hell.
Yeah, inside the Metro as well, every penny counts. Salma, interestingly, 1966 was the first ever Disasters and Emergency Committee appeal, and that was for an earthquake in Turkey all those years ago. And here we are seeing another appeal with the likes of Daniel Craig, also members of the royal family, all asking for help. But of course, it's difficult for people, isn't it, with a cost of living crisis?
I think this is absolutely a critical factor for those people who are usually incredibly generous with what they do. But I think that, I mean, this is probably slightly me being over patriotic, but I think the British are very high up there on the list of people who are always willing to give. And I think it's important that these campaign and that people who have a platform like the royal family, like celebrities like Daniel Craig, are there sort of asking for that help, because as Steve rightly says, it's a humanitarian crisis. This isn't the same as kind of like political difficulties. This isn't a cause. There is no blame here. This is about getting help to people urgently and immediately. The challenge, as I say, just to reiterate, is always about whether those structures are there in order to help people. The factor, as you just rightly pointed out, is the weather, the challenges that are faced with emergency services in these countries, about whether they are robust enough to deal with an issue of this magnitude. And I think being able to also look at some of those issues to how you can ease the pain for those people who don't necessarily have the infrastructure in order to get people out of this rubble is going to be really critical as we go through that relief effort.
Yeah, it really is. It's the same story on the front of the Financial Times. They also mentioned that UN convoy of 6 trucks that's been able to get from Turkey across the border into Syria. Just the tip of the iceberg, of course. Steve, let's move our attention to the new Deputy Conservative Party Chairman, Lee Anderson, who said that he would support reintroducing the death penalty. What did you make of this?
Yeah, well, I mean, this row actually comes up every now and again. It's got the headlines because he's just been made deputy chairman, and no doubt with a sort of slightly clunky but deliberate attempt to target the so-called red wall seats with this kind of talk. And it's got a lot of people very worked up. I wonder how far this will go and take him and the arguments that he espouses. Quite often in politics, you get kind of maverick figures rising not to the very top or the sort of cabinet rank and so on, but hovering around that area. They generate a lot of headlines, but don't last that long. I might be wrong with him, but I doubt it somehow.
Yeah, Salma, the Prime Minister said today, that's not my view, that's not the government's view. Simple as that.
Yes, and this is one of those things where it's going to continually cause political issues because of the way that Lee Anderson is potentially going to rub up against the sort of status quo as it is. The death penalty in this country is not going to change. The status of the death penalty in this country is not going to change. And I think it will serve as a distraction to have these kinds of headlines whenever Lee Anderson decides that he wants to make a statement. And as Steve rightly says, it is that kind of maverick element. But nonetheless, Lee Anderson was obviously chosen for a reason to become the deputy party chairman, and it is the fact that he has these red wall credentials. I think the Prime Minister is going to have to think very hard about how Lee Anderson is now deployed in the wider sort of sphere when he's thinking about campaigning. But these sort of asides, I think, will provide Number 10 with a number of headaches over the sort of next 18 months before a general election.
OK, let's move on to a couple of financial stories in the Mail and the Mirror. Starting with the Mail, Steve, when will Treasury get the message over tax?
This is so interesting because you have the Liz Truss intervention, and while she herself was much ridiculed for her return to the centre of the political stage, the message about tax cuts, even after all that happened last September and October, when there was an attempt at these tax cuts and just all hell broke loose. Well, it's returned in the very powerful Daily Mail. It's been around in the Daily Mail for some time, and in some of the other Tory newspapers, and amongst MPs beyond the immediate entourage who were around Liz Truss. And what is so interesting is the immediate context, the build-up to the March budget, the sense of the Tories well behind in the opinion polls. And although it seems to me crazy to be raising the same kind of agenda that Truss had in September and October, there is a potency within parts of the Conservative Party for it, just as Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, prepares for a budget where he has been quite open, in the past anyway, that at this point, the tax-cutting agenda is not his.
OK, Salma, we'll perhaps get your thoughts on that story in the next hour, but just tell us very quickly about the front of the Mirror. What's Martin Lewis been saying?
Martin Lewis is very annoyed at the suggestion that the cap on energy pricing is going to increase, therefore sort of taking certain people out of this benefit that the government has been giving in terms of subsidy. And he has been very robust on the front page of the Mirror, saying that this would be a real catastrophe for those families. And I think that this is going to be something that continues, but the government position is very difficult because they don't have a lot to play with. So we'll see how this unfolds over the coming weeks.
Steve, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, again, in a way, it's the counter, isn't it? That while there is this huge demand for tax cuts, obviously to continue, and Martin Lewis is right, that I think in some form or another they will need to continue, costs money. So at the same time, you have these two conflicting pressures on Sunak and Hunt. From the Mail, cut taxes, cut taxes. From Martin Lewis, increase spending or borrowing to subsidise these still very high energy bills. Now, you know, can they do both? And the answer usually in these situations is no, when money is so tight. So it's a really vivid juxtaposition of the pressures they are under, and the pressures become much more intense when they are so far behind in the polls. What is the route back? Can they risk people saying we can't afford our bills again? Can they risk not cutting taxes when this shrill scream is out there in parts of the Tory party? It's a fascinating backdrop to this March budget.
Yeah, it really is, isn't it? It's going to be a very interesting few weeks in the run-up to that. And just to finish, a story from The Eye. This is completely different to all the other front pages. A bit of an exclusive by The Eye, Salma. Fergal Sharkey, the singer, has really been campaigning hard on this.
Yes, so this is a story that HS2 development has basically resulted in raw sewage from that being pumped into a green belt river. And this is, I think, a real sort of damaging thing for HS2, which is already under intense political pressure because big infrastructure projects are always under intense political pressure. And I think this is going to prove to be another one of those things that just adds more arguments to those people who have always thought that HS2 is a bad idea. But unfortunately, the government has committed the money. Things are progressing. So I don't think it will end up sort of hurting the project long term, but I think it does create a lot of cynicism around it continually.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very strong front page, isn't it, Steve?
Yeah, and it's deeply depressing. I think they also name Thames Water as well. And it is somehow a kind of depressing metaphor that this is going on around quite a lot of Britain's coastal areas and in rivers and so on. And it has to be stopped. It is utterly grotesque. And whether it can be done with regulation or whether these kind of privatized monopolies with clearly inadequate regulation is just an unsustainable model. I'm not sure, but it has to stop. And I think it will be one of the quite early challenges if there is a new Labour government next year at some point, as to whether this can be done, because we keep on hearing, oh yeah, don't worry, it's being sorted, you know, and so on. And yet every month or so, you get more examples of it happening, and it's terrible.
Yeah, we haven't got the response from Thames Water, as we only have the front pages, of course, but Fergal Sharkey says it's another grotesque example of what the Environment Agency calls regulation, with yet more damage being done to a wonderful river. Picture there of the river column by Thames Water there.